Okay, good evening, everyone. Welcome to the Brilsey for this lecture on insect decline. I'm Tony Symes. On my normal life, I'm the convener for the Herschel Astronomy Group. We've also touched on this issue with the light at night. Some time ago, I had organized a Herschel lecture and I went down with COVID, and Stuart Reynolds very kindly introduced the talk and did the convener thing for me. So it's only fair that I should return the favor tonight. And also, as I said, that lecture touched on the same subject, insect decline, but in the context of light pollution and how it also annoys astronomers. Stuart Reynolds has been active with the Bath Royal Literary and Scientific Institution for many years. He's also an emeritus professor of biology at Bath University. And so without any further ado, let me hand over to Stuart.
Thank you very much, Tony. So tonight, I'm going to talk about insect declines. Insects are both extraordinarily diverse and numerous. And to a first approximation, almost all animals are insects. So recently, we've been hearing a lot of scientific stories in the press and digital media about how insects are in trouble. But of course, you mustn't believe everything that you read in the papers. And you may have wondered whether insects really are about to go extinct. So in this lecture, I'm going to try and tell you. It turns out that it's actually quite difficult to say. And I think that one of the important take-home messages from my lecture tonight is about the difficulty of estimating the numbers of critters out there in the field. And I'll talk a good deal about this from a sort of ecological methodology point of view. But I hope that that won't seem dull. It's actually a realistic appraisal of how difficult it is to do this kind of science. I'll review the evidence, I'll highlight the uncertainties, and there are plenty, and I'll try and unpack what all of this means for the state of nature and life on Earth. Finally, I'll talk about what we can do about this state of affairs, and I'll ask, does it matter? Well, here's the spoiler, and you can stop listening now if you want to put your fingers in your ears. Yes, there really is a problem. It may well be that it's inevitable because of the way that we live our lives. Nevertheless, there are some things that we can do to limit the impact of insect declines. So this is where most public mentions of insect declines begin. Years ago, it is said you couldn't drive your car anywhere in the summer without getting it covered in dead insects, especially at the front end and on the windscreen. And I myself remember this well from 50 years ago, seems like yesterday. On a long journey, you might well have to get out and wash the windscreen more than once in order to carry on driving. And this now simply does not happen. The implication is that it doesn't happen because there are fewer insects, so that there are fewer splats on the windscreen. As we shall see later on in the talk, you can actually use this windscreen effect to measure a proxy of the number of flying insects in the air. But in reality, despite the ubiquity of the phenomenon, people actually didn't notice over those 50 years that insects were disappearing until there were other indications that they'd already gone. By the way, the windscreen technique does have its problems. Car design has changed considerably in the past half century, and the aerodynamic design of cars means that fewer insects are killed through windscreen contacts. But still, as long as you use the same windscreen consistently, or at least one that's very similar, then the technique really ought to be useful. And interestingly, I have a friend at a university not far from here who regularly drives a car every year from the UK to Eastern Europe. And he assures me that the windscreen effect still operates in Eastern Europe, where agriculture is a bit less intensive than it is here. And according to him, as you leave Austria and enter Hungary, that's where the splats on the windscreen start. Personally, I'd like to see this question studied a bit more carefully, but it's certainly an interesting anecdote. So, where did scientific concern about insect declines begin? Well, this concern isn't new. It first erupted seriously in about 2005 to 2006, when there were unexplained catastrophic losses of honeybees, firstly in the USA and then over almost the whole world. And the problem was called colony collapse disorder, CCD. The beekeeper would come along and find that there were no bees. They'd all disappeared. And the inference was that they had died while they were outside of the hive. Something rather similar emerged a little later in Europe in 2009 to 2013. And CCD apparently threatened to decimate both the honey industry and also to inflict serious damage on fruit and nut growers, because the bees pollinate those crops, and without them you get a poor yield. But in thinking about all of this, you need to remember that honeybees are not wild animals. This is essentially a veterinary or management problem. What's actually being measured here is the number of working beehives, not the number of bees. And the graph at the right-hand side here shows you that actually in the United States, right throughout the whole CCD episode, actually beekeepers managed to maintain the number of hives in operation at much the same level throughout those years. Nevertheless, CCD does have some relevance to the declines that are seen in other insects. And what do we know about this colony collapse disorder? We know a good deal more about it than any other kind of insect decline. It was intensively investigated for around a decade, but the real cause was never definitively established. And it's pretty clear that there was a wide range of factors at work, one of which was a virus. It's an RNA virus. It's called the deformed wing virus. And the originally circulating model of this virus declined, and a new one took its place over the years of the CCD epidemic. Sounds familiar? Yeah? The really interesting thing about this, from the point of view of a scientist who's really interested in the biology of disease, is that the virus alone was not responsible for all of these problems. It turns out that there were several other factors at work, one of which is that these mites, nasty-looking things, which infest both adult flying bees and also their developing immature forms, these mites are bloodsuckers, and they actually transmit this virus. And so if you have this mite, varroa, and you also have the virus, then you get a much worse form of the disease. Moreover, there are other parasites. These are single-celled organisms that live in the bee's gut, Nosema cerani, and this is a form of Nosema that spread greatly during the CCD years, and it turns out that Nosema as well exacerbates the effect of the deformed wing virus. Moreover, there's been a lot of worry that sublethal poisoning with this pesticide, thiamethoxam, it's one of the so-called neonicotinoid or neonics, which is extensively used in treating seeds, and it's a systemic insecticide. It gets into the pollen and the nectar of plants that grow from these treated seeds. And this gets back into the bees, and that diminishes their immune resistance to the virus. So all of these things were happening at once. And that's probably why CCD happened. But it isn't just honeybees that have been declining. Other pollinators are also in trouble. And this has been studied extensively by a team at NERC's Institute of Ecology and Hydrology in Oxfordshire. And these other pollinators are also very important to us humans. They consist of wild bees, like these solitary bees here, and also bumblebees like this one. And as well as this, there are other pollinators like hoverflies. And what this graph shows is that a very large database of the UK ranges of these insects shows that there's been a decline in both of these kinds of wild pollinator over a period of about 30 year. It's not all of the insects that decline. Some of them actually prosper. This is a bumblebee that has done exceptionally badly. It turns out that it's a specialist in rather uncommon environments, and it's pretty clear that it is in trouble because its unimproved grassland habitats rich in wildflowers have drastically declined over the years. But there are other bees like this one, which many of you will have seen in your gardens. I certainly do in mine. It's the ashy mining bee, and it's done particularly well over the years, and that's because it's a specialist pollinator of oilseed rape. And the success of this bee really shouldn't be a surprise over this time, because over the 40 years from 1970 till 2010, the crop of oilseed rape has increased more than 160-fold. Essentially, this is a crop that was not grown in the UK before 1970 and is now part of the rotation in most arable farms. This take-home message from this study is that the environment determines whether these other non-honeybee pollinators do well or not. And it turns out that most of them don't do very well. About 2/3 of them decline, 1/3 increase. But actually, it's not just pollinators. What if all insects are declining? Would the drivers of such a problem be the same? And the International Union for the Conservation of Nature, IUCN, collates data on a wide range of animals. And a paper appeared in 2014 by a very fine Mexican ecologist called Rodolfo Dierzo. And this paper has become very influential. And what you can see here is that a rather high proportion of many insects are actually experiencing decreases or declines. This is worldwide data, and you can see that beetles and hymenopterans and grasshoppers in particular are very much under pressure. Some other groups like butterflies and particularly damselflies and dragonflies are much less susceptible, but all insects appeared in 2014 to be declining. This data was actually a bit hand-waving. It was obtained by writing to experts and asking them what they thought. Well, I think that we can do better than that. Dierzo and his colleagues did so in the same paper because they looked at some numerical records kept by amateur entomologists in the UK, which is one of the best studied places anywhere in the world for insect numbers. And again, you can see that all of these insects are experiencing losses, but some more than others. So this was the situation in the middle of the 2010s when a very loud alarm bell was rung by a very much more quantitative paper that actually attempted to measure how many insects there actually were in the environment. And over a 27-year period, members of the Krefeld Entomological Society — Krefeld is a small town, well, not so small actually, it's a city, a small city in the Rhineland. To give you an idea, it's twinned with Leicester. It's a fabric manufacturing city. And the members of the Krefeld Entomological Society embarked on a tremendous study using these flying insect traps. They're called malaise traps, which catch insects as they emerge from lower down, usually from the soil or the vegetation. And they collected the insects that were trapped in these nets and kept them and dried them and weighed them. And what they found was that when they revisited the same places, they routinely found that there were fewer insects caught than had been the case before. Now, this was actually a surprise to them. This study was not designed to collect this information. It emerged in the course of doing it. And so it's not a perfectly designed study. And we'll talk a bit more about that in a minute. This paper actually caused some controversy at the time that it came out. But I think that there's fairly general agreement that these declines are apparently real. And it may well be that we're only looking at pairwise comparisons, but they're all in the same direction. And there's a clearly statistically significant decline in the mass of insects caught in each day in these traps. And it slopes down at 2.8% per year. And over the 27 years of the study, there's a 75% decrease in biomass. Now, this is extremely alarming. What would it mean for nature? Well, straight away, these results were picked up by the press and by digital media, and were given great public exposure, generally with headlines like hyper alarming, bug apocalypse, the insect apocalypse, and so on, implying that this result might be typical of what was going on everywhere. How did entomologists react to this? Well, it's quite interesting to me that the response was pretty quick. This was the year in which that Crefeld paper was published, 2017. Actually, a couple of papers that were the first to use the term decline in relation to insect populations had both been published in 2006. So there was some interest in entomological communities in this topic. And that was, of course, why the paper by Holman et al., the Crefeld paper, was noticed so quickly. But straight away, there was a lot of reaction. And to everyone's astonishment, it was discovered that loads of longitudinal studies looking at insect numbers over a period of years had actually been going on for a number of years, not with the intention of revealing the extent of declines, but designed for completely other purposes. Actually, most of these other studies were designed to monitor pest numbers. But of course, when you catch pest insects, you tend to catch all the insects. And so from this time onwards, there were upwards of 20 papers a year being published, all with new data on these declines. And they all said, or almost all of them said, the same thing. Now, it's regrettable that not all entomologists used measured language to describe this. And this paper in particular raised a lot of hackles, because what these people did was to underline the alarm of the press about the possible implications of this loss of insects. And these two authors from a university in Australia talked about dramatic rates of decline that may lead to the extinction of 40% of the world's insect species over the next few decades. Well, the trouble is that they weren't actually, this was a paper that measured nothing. What it did was to look at what other people had said. They sought out those papers which announced in their titles that they were looking at a decline, and they ignored all the other ones. And moreover, they made the rash assumption that if a decline had been measured over a period of time, that it would necessarily continue at the same rate in the future, which is, of course, highly unlikely. And so there was a lot of, shall I say, bad blood in the entomological community just at this time. But things have calmed down a lot, and I think that we've got a much better idea of what's going on. But it should be understood that it is a bit problematic to look at that Crefeld study data and conclude that what we're seeing is a linear correlation between insect numbers or insect weight and time. What's really going on in the underlying data was not seen in this study, because the Crefeld Entomological Society didn't go to the same site every year. What it did was to go periodically from one site to another. If you actually have data where you look at the abundance of insects in the same place, what you find is you get a lot of year-to-year variation. And this is largely driven by the weather, but also driven by other ecological factors. And so it would depend on exactly where you started and where you finished, whether you detected a decrease or an increase from the same data. Well, I think that actually the Crefeld data is really better than this criticism would imply, because of course what you have is lots of pairwise comparisons and they're all in the same direction. But nevertheless, you need to remember that this early paper, which is still quoted many, many times every year, was actually not really designed to detect what it was ultimately written up to claim. And this is the really uncomfortable part. Actually, it turns out that the people who wrote up the Crefeld paper didn't take account of the weather at the time that they were emptying their nets. And some other German ecologists did essentially the same experiments that had been done by the Crefeld amateur entomologist again more recently, and they took a lot of measurements in each year and correlated the numbers of insects with the weather conditions. And it turns out that nearly all of the variation you see here is explicable by the weather. And if you take this correlation and retrospectively apply it to all of these data points in the original Crefeld study from weather forecast records, it explains nearly all of the variation. So the paper that set all of the entomologists' interest rising in insect declines turns out probably to be wrong. And I say probably because, in fact, we have to bear in mind that this critique of the original Crefeld study was done entirely in South Germany, whereas the original data was actually all done in North Germany. So we still don't know, really. But we now have a lot more data, and I think that the take-home message that I'm going to give you is that the Crefeld study probably got the right answer for the wrong reasons. So what kind of a decline are we really talking about? And I just want to ram this point home here. We could be looking at fewer insect species. So we would go out with our net, one of these things, and we would find lots of different species of insect 20 years ago. And today we would do the same thing and we would find fewer species of insect. That is something that is there in the data. But equally, we could be looking at a species range contraction. Maybe we have these three geographical areas for these three species of insect, and over a period of time, for whatever reason, the ranges of these three different species would get smaller than they were before. And if we merely go out to a number of identified spots where we record the numbers of insects, we find three species in this place, but only one or none in these places. And this would give us an average species richness, as we ecologists say, over these sampled areas of 1.4. But if we do the same thing 20 years later with these smaller ranges, the average species richness is only 0.8. So this is the same apparent result from a different cause. It isn't that species are going extinct, it's just that their ranges are getting smaller, perhaps because conditions are more variable, or perhaps because the species concerned are getting more choosy. But what if these species ranges stay the same size, but they actually shift on the surface of the Earth? This is exactly the sort of thing that you'd expect to happen under climate change, for example. As a particular place gets warmer, maybe species ranges would move away from the hot part to the colder part. So here's our original situation, and let's suppose that the species ranges move a bit north and the species richness has gone down like that. And then again, it moves a bit further north and the species richness goes down still further. And then again, it goes down a bit further as the species ranges move still further north. So we've got another cause to give the same result. The other thing that might be going on is that actually everybody stays in the same place. The ranges are all the same, but maybe there are simply fewer insects, maybe because there's something nasty in the environment, which is killing them off. And when we weigh the insects, we find that there are simply less of them than there were. So these are the kinds of thing that we need to sort out, and we need to gather data that's good enough to get over the sampling problem and to tell us what kind of cause is acting. And it turns out, as I mentioned before, that there are a number of long-term surveys which have been doing this for many years. These pictures show the activities of the Rothamsted Insect Survey, which has been going for many years, since about 1960, and is still going on now. What happens is that either light traps operate at night to catch night-flying insects, or these suction traps suck air continuously out of higher moving air to look for insects that migrate during the day. This is mostly used for Lepidoptera, or moths. This is mostly used for aphids. And there are large numbers of sites all doing the same thing, and they've been doing it for 60 years. So there's a lot of data available. You just need to find it. And I really haven't time to talk about all of these different studies, but I'm just going to pick out one or two to tell you about. And one of the best is a new German study, which came out only 2 years after the original Krefeld study, doing essentially the same thing, but much more carefully, and with many more individual insects, which were analyzed to individual species. So they counted more than 1 million individual insects, more than 2,700 species over a period of 9 years. And they did this in grassland sites and in forest sites. And what you see is that there's a decrease in the diversity of species, but there's also a decrease in biomass. And interestingly, the loss of biomass is much greater over grassland than it is in the forests. And this is a topic I'll come back to. And the number of individuals fell greatly over the grassland sites. But interestingly, despite this fall in biomass, there was hardly any difference in the number of individuals collected over forest sites. And what this actually means is that the insects that did the declining to give you this loss of mass must have been the biggest ones. And probably these were big wood-boring beetles living in dead trees. Anyway, this is jolly good data. This is the sort of thing that we need. Nobody's whinging about the quality of this data. This tells us that this is really happening. And lots of such studies have taken place. And in 2020, this amazing paper came out by Roel van Klink, who works at the University of Würzburg in Germany. And people in his lab synthesized 166 different studies of that kind over 41 different countries, 1,676 different sites. The data covers almost a century. They're not all that long. The median start year is actually only in 1986. But nevertheless, the median time span of all of these studies is 20 years. So this is really excellent coverage. And what they find is some sites actually decline. They're the ones showed in red or pink. Others, shown in blue, actually you find an increase in insect numbers. So what that tells us is that whatever the factors are that are causing insect declines, they are not universal, they're not global, they're particular to those places. And well, we'll see later in the talk what people think they might be. One of the really interesting things about this study was that it showed that terrestrial sites on land all over the world appear to be declining, but freshwater insects, the ones that live as larvae under the surface of lakes and ponds, appear all over the world to be increasing. And that was totally unexpected. And this has since been confirmed by a number of other studies. And I think that the best possible explanation for this is that we still don't have much idea about what is causing the terrestrial insect declines. And so we really can't do much about it. But people have known for years about pollution in bodies of water. And so a lot has been done to clean up rivers, lakes, and ponds, and probably this lack of decline in freshwater insects is something to do with that. But I would be failing in my duty as a scientist not to tell you that not everybody finds the same thing. A very large set of studies called the long-term ecological research sites were set up in the 1960s in the USA. You can see all of these black dots are LTER sites, and they've been monitored for all kinds of biological variables that include 5,300 different time series for insects and other arthropods. They represent 68 different areas, some of which are natural ecosystems, some of which are managed, meaning that they're probably either parks or farms. And there was no significant decline in insect numbers at all in any of these sites. And this is a bit hard to explain. I think the best I could do really would be to say that probably most of these long-term ecological research sites were selected because they were already thought to be ecologically very interesting. Many of them are in national parks, and maybe the large size of American national parks insulates them somewhat from what's going on outside. And many of the other sites are actually within cities. And rather few of these sites are actually on farmland. And as we'll see later in the talk, it turns out that farmland is thought to be particularly a problem. So what does this all mean? What would happen if the insects were all to disappear? Well, insects are at the bottom of the food chain. Here's an oak tree. Here's an oak processionary that lives upon it. This is an insectivorous insect. It's a skylark, actually, that might eat a caterpillar. You can see it's eating one there. And in turn, insectivorous creatures like this might be eaten by predators like this sparrowhawk. And actually, of course, it's much more complicated than a simple linear food chain. What you really have is an assemblage in every ecosystem of very different plant species, many different insect herbivores that are each mostly specialists on the plants within the ecosystem. And you have insectivores, many of which are actually quite specialized too. And then at the top of the food chain, you have predators, which tend not to be very specialized and eat a wide range of other animals in the row beneath them. And what goes on in this eco food web is the well-known pyramid of numbers. You have lots of material and energy flowing up from the plants to the herbivores, much less flowing up from the insects to the insectivores, and much less still making progress up to the top level of predators. So if you take away the insects from this food chain, clearly you're going to have bad effects on the ecological trophic levels above them. And to illustrate this, I'm going to talk about the most dramatic effect of these insect declines, which is on insectivorous birds. It turns out that the majority of bird species are in fact insectivorous. More than half of bird species are mostly dependent on eating insects for a living. So here's a windchat, here's a blue tit. These photographs obligingly show you the insects being eaten by the birds. Here is a tree swallow. We don't have tree swallows in the UK, but they're a very common hirundine in North America. And you can see that this swallow is certainly a very clever insectivorous species. This is a spotted flycatcher. These are aerial insectivores that catch insects on the wing. They're much less common. Only 2.5% of bird species are able to catch insects on the wing like this, but they're actually rather numerous, and they're very easy to study while they're eating their insects, because you can actually see them doing it. And moreover, they tend to nest in nice places like swallows do, so that you can actually measure their success very easily. And we'll come back to that in a minute. But these insectivorous birds have a massive ecological impact on their environment. They're ecologically important. They eat prodigious quantities of insects. It's been recently estimated to be about 500 million metric tons of insects per year. And while that's only a small fraction of the globe's total annual net primary production, a simple calculation tells us that these insectivorous birds actually take a huge toll on insects. So let's guess how many insects there are on the planet. Globally, forests are estimated to generate about 37.8 billion tons of new plant material per year. And typically it's said that about 10% of those 37.8 billion tons of new plant material will be eaten by insects each year. So assuming, and this is a very rough calculation, that those insects turn that material that they eat into new insect bodies with a similar efficiency of about 10%, then the annual production of insects is probably about 4 billion tons per year. So if forests are producing all of those insects, it turns out that our calculation tells us that about 1/8 of all the insects that are grown each year in the forests, that's 12.5%, will be eaten by insectivorous birds every year. Well, it's not all of them, but we haven't even started thinking about what bats might do or other creatures. It's pretty clear that insects are under the cosh all the time from insectivorous birds. And the reverse side of that coin is that if the insect numbers start to decline, then so will the insectivorous birds. And this is indeed exactly what has been seen over the years in many places. This is data for the UK. Woodland birds have declined by about 20% over the last 50 years. Other upland birds, wetland birds, seabirds haven't declined to the same extent. The seabirds are a bit, the data's a bit rough, but the upland birds and the wetland birds certainly haven't declined in the same way. So this bears out our calculation that insectivorous birds are likely to do badly under insect decline. But the really interesting thing is it turns out that the farmland birds have done much worse. They have declined over the past 50 years by about 60%. This is an awful lot. And if we unpack this data a bit more, and this is official government information from DEFRA, this is all farmland birds, but agricultural land specialists have done even worse than the average of all birds that you see on farmland. And those birds that you see on farmland that are actually generalists, in other words, they're only on the farmland because they're everywhere, these haven't declined at all. So it looks as though there's something rather special about farmland, which causes insectivorous birds to do even worse than they do in woodland, which is their main place of insect production. So this decline actually was steepest about 40 or so years ago. And it has been followed by a period of relative stasis, but things have not gone back to where they were before. Indeed, there is a continued decline, although it's less steep. And if you look at these birds in these categories, what you see is that there are a number of species which decline very strongly, whereas others decline less quickly. So some birds are affected more than others. And I really like this paper, so I'm going to tell you all about it. Lots of entomologists think that it's a bit naff, but I really like it. It's a windscreen study done by Anders Möller, who, despite the name, actually works at the University of Paris, although he obviously is a Dane and he spends his summers at his estate at home in northern Denmark, in Jutland, near this village of Grede. And he drives his car around and he counts the number of splats on the windscreen. This is farmland. This is an aerial view. You can see it's all fields, and it's a classic serial rotation country. Here's a picture of a barley crop in this place. And what he has observed over a period of more than 20 years is that the number of squashed insects has declined by more than 80%. And in parallel with this, the numbers of swallows, house martins, and sand martins nesting in the same area of Denmark has also decreased, and the decrease is described quite well in each case by a relationship between breeding success of the birds and insect abundance. So I think this is pretty strong evidence that not only are insect declines occurring in this place, but they are also having this strong effect on these very characteristic aerial insectivores. The other thing that it tells you is that despite the scientific excellence of Anders Möller, he doesn't drive very fancy cars. This is a Polo, and this is a Fiesta. So he's obviously not very well paid. But there you go. He actually controlled for whether the car made a difference to the results, but it didn't. Which maybe the old, if he drives cars like mine, it would simply have conked out halfway through. Anyway, so is this kind of stuff happening everywhere? And the answer is it is. For example, migratory insects are declining in China. There's a fantastic study done in northeast China. Whoops, sorry. Up here in the Bohai Sea, there's a marine station on Buhuang Island, which this research group has taken over, and they have these mega searchlights shining up into the air that trap insects into a big funnel. And they also have radar that points up into the sky, and they measure the number of passing insects that way. And either way that they do it, they see a dramatic decline in the number of insects over the years. It's less than we see in Europe, but it's about it's almost 1% per year. And one of the interesting things that these Chinese scientists did was to look at the insects that they caught in the trap. So this is the light trap. And they classified them according to species, and they worked out where they were on a food web and decided whether they were herbivorous insect pests or their natural enemies. And what they found, so here, for example, these red dots, these are all the herbivorous insects, and the blue dots are all of the carnivorous insects that eat them. And so here's a ground beetle, here's a tiger beetle, Here's a hunting wasp. Here's a lacewing. All of these insects are natural enemies. And what the Chinese scientists found was that the rate of decline of the pests was actually much less than the rate of decline of the natural enemies. And this ought to be ringing alarm bells, because what that means is that actually you're making the pest situation worse, however it is you're causing these insect declines. And when they looked at the pest population growth rate, they found that it was inversely proportional to the natural enemy population in the previous year, exactly as you'd expect. So over the years, they're causing pest problems to get worse. And actually, this should have come as no surprise, because entomologists, applied entomologists, have known for years that you can make pest problems worse by trying to kill the pests. Because when you spread your insecticide on the environment, actually you kill not only the pests, but also the things that eat them. And actually you finish up with pest resurgence, which is a well-known phenomenon. And it's one of the reasons why we ought to be really very careful about how we use pesticides. I might say more about that later. So, running a bit short of time here, but I'll just deal with this because this is the bit that everybody gets really excited about. What actually causes insect declines? Well, people come up with all kinds of explanations. These are all hypothetical causes of insect declines that have been mentioned by well-known and distinguished students of the situation. And I'm going to talk about just 5 of these. First, very briefly, these 4, because they're almost certainly important. And then I'm going to talk particularly about insecticides, because everybody gets very excited about this. So you need to bear in mind, though, that probably this is a situation just like with the honeybee colony collapse disorder. All of these things are probably acting all at once and maybe synergistically to cause a loss of insect diversity and biomass. So the first thing is it due to land use change? And actually, the best way to study this is not looking at different years, but to look at different places all at the same time and to correlate what happens to insect diversity according to the intensity of land use. And as you move from primary vegetation, like, oh, I don't know, untouched forest, to secondary vegetation, which might be a plantation, to low intensity agriculture, which is the sort of thing that you can do with lots of people, or high intensity agriculture, which is what you do with one bloke on a tractor and lots of chemicals. What you find is that the total insect abundance falls as you take away the primary forest, and then it falls again as you move from low intensity agriculture to high intensity. Interestingly enough, growing crops itself doesn't seem much different from growing tree crops in terms of insect abundance. Although when you look at species richness for the insects, you find that there's a pretty big difference as you go through all of these categories. So certainly land use change is likely to be involved in insect declines. Light pollution is certainly, it's easy to show that in places where you have lots of lights, that insects do badly. And we know that light intensity has greatly increased, certainly in cities. This is London, in case you don't recognize it. The intensity of light has greatly increased from over the last decade, for example, largely due to LED street lights. And some places in the world have such a lot of artificial light that it probably makes a difference. Europe and the eastern seaboard of the US and Japan are all certainly oversupplied with light by global standards, and it is very likely that light pollution leads to some loss of insects. But it's unlikely to account for the loss of insect diversity and biomass over farmland, because actually most farms don't have streetlights. But perhaps it might have some effect on insect migrations. Climate change is certainly a problem that a lot of people are interested in. Here in this national park in remote northwest Costa Rica, insect catches at light traps have obviously fallen away over the last 50 years, particularly over the last 20 years. This is a graph showing you the total numbers of species collected at these light traps. If you look at the various different families of Lepidoptera caught at these traps, they almost are all significantly declining in number. That's the number of species, that is. There isn't good data on biomass for this kind of thing, but it's not certain that this is due to climate change. The people who produced this data assert that it is, but they didn't check systematically for other possible causes. Certainly, in such a remote location, it does appear quite plausible. But of course, the thing that everybody's really interested in, because it would appear that we could do something about it so easily, is to blame pesticides. And the trouble is that there are loads of pesticides, but attention has focused very much on one particular class of insecticides, the neonicotinoids, of which this is an example. This is the same compound that I introduced you to earlier on in the talk. And it's used a lot in seed dressings, and it is suspected of causing damage to bees. Now, you can show very easily in laboratory studies that insects finish up with smaller brains if they're reared on a diet of tiny amounts of these pesticides. But that's a lab experiment. Is it really the cause of the problem in the field? And the insecticide companies fairly predictably assert that lab studies are no good because laboratory scientists, in their opinion, always use too much insecticide, and it isn't a surprise that an insecticide will have a bad effect on an insect. What you really need is epidemiological data where you can measure the exposure of natural populations of insects to chemicals and show that they do badly under those conditions. Actually, by the time that such data was eventually considered by scientists, the European community had already decided to ban neonicotinoid pesticides for almost all purposes, largely due to public pressure, which I suppose shows that people are often convinced of the truth of something before scientists can actually prove it. But nevertheless, there is now evidence that neonicotinoids can cause damage to insect populations in the field, although it's not terribly strong evidence. In the case of wild bee species, there are clearly effects on affected populations, but they're sublethal effects, and it is asserted in this government-sponsored study that these could scale up to cause losses of biodiversity. It's more certain that neonicotinoids have damaging effects on honeybees. On the other hand, this study of wild pollinators in Sweden did come up with effects on wild bee density of an epidemiological kind, but they couldn't see effects on honeybee colonies. But they're actually using a different insecticide from the one used by these people. But the evidence is actually not terribly strong, which is probably why the manufacturers continue to fight a rearguard action saying, oh, no, it's not us. But I think that most entomologists are pretty convinced that this is what's really going on. Interestingly, quite by surprise, it turned out that another agrochemical, not an insecticide at all, it's actually a fungicide, was almost certainly responsible for damage to honeybees, and it's actually because it alters the gut microbiota of bee larvae, and they die prematurely. And as a result, there's an EU ban on the use of this chemical, which is actually has been one of the most frequently used agrochemicals in the world over the last 50 years. So pesticides certainly are contributing to these problems. Now, I'm really overrunning, and I'm sorry about this, but I just want to say a few simple things at the end. So where's the surprise? We shouldn't be surprised at any of the things that I've said. In the past, the agricultural environment was very different to what it is now. A few cows in a small field. Nowadays, this is how cows are kept in feedlots in Argentina and North America. This is the way that crops are grown. Wildflower meadows like this simply hardly exist now. And harvesting takes place in fields completely free from weeds and on a massive scale. What's happening here is that farmers are taking more and more of the small fraction of sunlight which falls on the earth, which goes into photosynthesis and is produced as an increase in plant weight each year. We call it net primary productivity, or NPP. Basically, this is the production of the earth in terms of biology. And of this NPP, we actually appropriate, whoops. So what's happened over the past century is that the share of the Earth's productivity, which we humans appropriate, has increased from about 30% to more than 70%. In other words, we're simply taking too much. That's the take-home message. We shouldn't take so much, and what we need to do is to leave a bit of resource for the insects to eat. It's very easy to do. You can leave a strip at the side of the field or at the headland, and new legislation is in the process of being enacted to reward farmers for doing this. And I personally am very optimistic that this will help a great deal with this problem of insect decline in the UK. Whether countries elsewhere in the world will take advantage of the same responses, I don't know. Anyway, thank you very much.